You know what finally made me lose my patience? I'd built a garden gate out of white oak. Good lumber too. Paid more than I should have at the yard, picked through the pile myself, sealed it with the best exterior finish I could find. And 18 months later, the stiles were cupping, the joints were opening up, and the whole thing looked like it had been sitting in a swamp for a decade. I kept thinking I was doing something wrong. Wrong finish, wrong joint, wrong species. But then I started reading about how the Vikings built their longships, and I realized the problem wasn't me. The problem was the wood itself, not the species, the way it was made into a board. Those Norse shipwrights were crossing the North Atlantic in open boats made of oak planks that flexed in heavy seas, shed water like a duck's back, and held together for decades. And the plank they used? You cannot buy it. Not at any lumberyard, not from any specialty dealer, not at any price. It does not exist in the modern lumber supply chain. Today I'm going to show you exactly what that plank is, why it's stronger and more durable than anything you can buy, why it vanished from the world, and what it looks like next to the board sitting in your shop right now. Plus, stick around to the end because I'll share an old Norse trick for reading a tree before you ever put a tool to it, one that tells you whether a log is worth splitting before you waste a single swing. Let's get into it. Here's the paradox that got me hooked on this whole subject. The strongest, most water-resistant plank that has ever been used in woodworking, a plank with a track record stretching back over 1,000 years, is commercially extinct. You can walk into any lumberyard in America and choose from 100 different products. But the one board that was strong enough to cross an ocean is not on any shelf, in any catalog, from any supplier. And when you understand why, it changes how you think about every piece of lumber you've ever bought. Let me give you some background on where this comes from, because it matters. During the Viking Age, roughly the late 700s through the 1000s, Scandinavian shipwrights built some of the most remarkable wooden vessels in history. The Gokstad ship, pulled from a burial mound in Norway in 1880, was built around 890. When archaeologists examined it, the hull planks were still in astonishing condition after nearly 1,000 years in the ground. The Oseberg ship, found nearby, dates to around 820 and tells the same story. These were clinker-built vessels, meaning the hull was made of overlapping planks riveted together, and those planks had to do something that would terrify any modern engineer. They had to flex. An ocean-going longship could not be rigid. A rigid hull in a North Atlantic storm would crack apart, so the planks needed to bend with the waves, spring back without breaking, and keep water out through every cycle of flexing and relaxing. The shipwrights solved this, not with fancy joinery or exotic materials, but with how they turned a tree into a board. They used European white oak, what we'd compare to our domestic white oak here in the States. But they didn't saw it, they split it. And that single decision, splitting instead of sawing, is the foundation of everything I'm about to share with you. There's a principle in Norse woodworking that doesn't have a fancy name, but I'd describe it this way. The tree already knows what shape it wants to be, and your job is to let it show you. That sounds like philosophy, but it's actually the most practical building advice I've ever encountered. Because when you split a log instead of sawing it, you're letting the wood's own grain structure dictate the shape of the plank. And that makes all the difference. So let's start with the most basic question. What actually is a riven plank? Riving means splitting wood along its natural grain using wedges, a froe, or both, instead of cutting it with a saw. When you rive a plank from a log, you're not slicing across the wood fibers. You're separating them along the path they already follow. Think of it like peeling a string cheese apart versus cutting it with a knife. When you peel it, the strands stay intact, full length, unbroken. When you cut it, you sever strands at random. A riven plank comes out of the log tapered because trees are tapered. It comes out with slightly irregular width because grain doesn't run in perfectly parallel lines. And it comes out with every single wood fiber running unbroken from one end of the board to the other. That's the key. Full-length, unbroken fibers, every one of them intact. Now pick up a board from your shop. If it came from a lumberyard, it was sawn. And no matter how carefully it was milled, the saw blade cut across grain lines. Look at the end grain and you'll see it. The annual rings enter one face and exit the other at some angle, and every place where the blade crossed a fiber, that fiber is severed. A riven plank doesn't have that. Every fiber is whole, and that changes everything about how the wood performs. Now here's where the science gets really compelling, and this is the part that made me rethink every outdoor project I'd ever built. When you leave the grain fibers intact, two things happen. First, the plank is dramatically stronger in tension. Wood gets its tensile strength from those long cellulose fibers running the length of the board. When you saw across them, you weaken the board at every point where a fiber is cut. A Riven plank retains the full tensile strength the tree grew with. Tests on Riven oak versus sawn oak of the same species and similar dimensions show the Riven piece can be 30 to 50% stronger in bending. That's not a subtle difference. That's the difference between a hull plank that flexes in a storm and one that snaps. Second, and this is what matters most for durability, intact fibers shed water instead of absorbing it. When you saw through oak, you expose the open ends of the wood cells on both faces. Those open cells act like tiny straws, wicking moisture into the board. That's why your sawn oak gate cups and swells and eventually rots. A Riven surface has the cell walls intact and lying flat like shingles on a roof. Water hits the surface and runs off because there are no open channels to absorb it. This is why Viking ships could sit in saltwater for years without the planking rotting through. It's why Riven oak shingles on medieval European buildings lasted 100 years or more. It's not magic. It's grain structure, left intact instead of being destroyed by a saw blade. When I finally understood this, I stood in my shop looking at a stack of quarter-sawn white oak I'd just bought and thought, every one of these boards has been wounded by the milling process, and I never even knew it. By the way, if you are enjoying learning about these shipwright methods, I put together something I think you will really appreciate. It is called Secrets of the Shipyard, and it covers 16 chapters of Viking and naval carpentry techniques that most woodworkers have never seen. 150 pages of real hands-on knowledge. You can grab your copy by scanning the QR code on screen or just use the first link in the description. All right, let us keep going. So if Riven planks are this good, why can't you buy one? I asked myself that question for a long time, and the answer turns out to be 5 problems that make commercial production impossible. First, riving requires straight-grained timber, not mostly straight, perfectly straight. One twist, one major knot, one deviation in the grain, and the split runs off course, and you lose the plank. That kind of timber comes from old-growth trees that grew slowly in dense forests, reaching for light, producing long, clean trunks with minimal branching. Most of that old-growth oak is gone. Second, every plank must be split by hand. There is no machine that can rive a board. The entire process depends on reading the grain of that specific log and guiding the split with wedges and a furrow, adjusting pressure and placement as you go. It's skilled handwork that cannot be automated. Third, yield is terrible by commercial standards. A sawmill can turn an 18-inch log into a dozen or more boards of predictable dimension. That same log, Riven, might give you 6 to 8 usable planks, and some of those will be thicker on one end than the other. Fourth, every Riven plank is a unique dimension. They come out tapered, slightly wedge-shaped, and no two are exactly the same width or thickness. You cannot assign a Riven plank a dimensional lumber size. There's no such thing as a Riven 1x6. Fifth, because of all of this, there is no supply chain, no grading standard, no packaging system, no way to stack them on a shelf and sell them by the linear foot. The modern lumber industry is built on standardization, and Riven wood is the opposite of standardized, so it simply doesn't exist in the marketplace. Not because it's inferior, because it can't be turned into a commodity. Let me describe what you see when you put a Riven plank next to a lumberyard board, because once you see this difference with your own eyes, you will never look at lumber the same way again. Take a piece of sawn white oak, quarter sawn if you can get it, and set it on your bench. Now imagine next to it a plank that was split from a straight-grained oak log. The first thing you notice is the surface. The sawn board has a smooth, uniform surface, with tiny scratches from the blade. The Riven plank has a slightly textured surface that follows the undulation of the natural grain. It almost looks alive. Now look at the edge. On the sawn board, you can see where the blade crossed through growth rings at various angles, leaving exposed end grains scattered across the face. On the Riven plank, the grain lines flow from end to end without interruption. Run your fingernail across the face of the sawn board, and you'll feel it catch slightly on the severed fibers. Do the same on the Riven plank and your nail glides. Now flex both boards, clamp one end and push down on the other. The sawn board flexes and feels stiff, with a sense that it might snap if you push too far. The Riven plank flexes further, with a springy, resilient feel, like it wants to come back. And if you set both pieces outside in the rain, the sawn board will show water, staining and absorption within hours. The Riven plank will bead water on the surface, like a freshly waxed car. That's the difference between severed grain and intact grain, and it's visible, tactile, and immediate. Here's the empowering part of this whole story, and it's the reason I wanted to share it with you. The only way to own a Riven plank, the strongest and most durable board you will ever work with, is to do exactly what the Vikings did. Split it yourself. And the truth is, it's not as difficult as it sounds. You need a straight-grained oak log, ideally 12 inches in diameter or more. You need steel splitting wedges, a heavy maul or sledge, a froe, and a froe club. A hewing hatchet helps for cleaning up the faces afterward. You start by splitting the log in half, then quartering it. Then you work each quarter, splitting radially along the growth rings, peeling off planks one at a time. Each split follows the grain, and you guide it by placing your wedge or froe where the grain tells you to go. The planks that come off the log will be roughly 1 to 2 inches thick, tapered from butt end to tip, and each one will have that unbroken grain running full length. It takes time. It takes practice reading the grain and learning where to place your wedges, but it's honest handwork that any woodworker with a maul and some patience can learn. And the plank you end up with is something no amount of money can buy. Let me share some patterns I've noticed over the years, things I used to do myself that this tradition handles completely differently. No judgment here. I did all of these for longer than I'd like to admit. The first pattern is reaching for treated lumber whenever a project is going outdoors. Most of us do this because we've been told that chemicals are what make wood last outside. But the Viking approach says that grain integrity is your first line of defense against moisture, not preservatives. An intact riven surface repels water structurally at the cellular level before any finish is even applied. The second pattern is assuming that all boards of the same species perform the same. I used to think white oak is white oak, so any board of it should work for a given project. But a flat sawn board and a riven board from the same tree will perform so differently outdoors that they might as well be different species. How the board was extracted from the log matters as much as what species the tree was. The third pattern is believing that thickness equals strength. When something needs to be strong, most of us reach for thicker stock, but a riven plank 3/4 of an inch thick can outperform a sawn board 1 1/4 inches thick because every fiber is intact and contributing to the strength. The Vikings built hull planks roughly 1 inch thick that held together in the North Atlantic. They didn't need thickness. They had unbroken grain. The fourth pattern is trusting that kiln-dried means stable. Kiln drying reduces moisture content, but it doesn't change the fact that sawn surfaces will absorb and release moisture through exposed end grain for the rest of their lives. A riven plank, even air-dried, will remain more dimensionally stable over time because the intact cell walls resist moisture exchange from the start. The good news is, once you see these patterns for what they are, you start making different choices. Not necessarily riving every board in your shop, but understanding what you're giving up when you use sawn lumber and knowing when it matters most. Now for that bonus tip I promised at the beginning. This one comes from studying how Norse shipwrights selected their timber, and I've never seen it mentioned in any modern woodworking resource. Before they felled a tree for riving, they didn't just look at the trunk. They read the tree the way you'd read a face. First, they looked at the bark. On a white oak with straight grain, the bark furrows run vertically with very little spiral or twist. If the bark furrows spiral even slightly around the trunk, the grain inside spirals too, and that log will not rive cleanly. Second, they looked at the branches. A tree with branches clustered near the top and a long, clean trunk below has been growing in a dense stand, competing for light, and that produces the straight, even grain you need. A tree with branches, starting low on the trunk, grew in the open, and almost certainly has a regular grain. Third, and this is the part I love, they would make a small test split before committing. They'd cut a short section off the butt end of the felled tree, maybe 8 to 10 inches long, and drive a wedge into it. If the split ran straight and true across the full diameter, they knew the log was good. If the split wandered or dove off to one side, they'd move on to the next tree. I started doing this with every oak log I source for riving, and it has saved me hours of wasted effort. One small test split tells you more about a log than any visual inspection of the outside. It's the kind of quiet, practical wisdom that the old craftsmen used every day, and that we've completely forgotten. One more thing before I let you go. I spent a long time gathering the best traditional shipwright methods I have come across, and I put them all into a book called Secrets of the Shipyard. 16 chapters of techniques that most modern woodworkers have never seen, with hand-drawn illustrations and clear explanations you can actually follow in your shop. Scan the QR code on screen right now, or grab it from the first link in the description. I appreciate you watching, and if you want more of these deep dives, make sure to subscribe. I will see you in the next one. Here's what stays with me every time I think about this subject. The best plank in the history of woodworking is the one that no lumberyard will ever stock and no amount of money can buy. But any woodworker with a straight oak log, a maul, and a set of wedges can make one with his own hands, the same way it's been done for over 1,000 years. We didn't lose this plank because something better came along. We lost it because something cheaper came along. And now you know the difference.